Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Our guest today is Kieran Mulvaney, a journalist and author who has written for the National Geographic, The Guardian, among many other publications. His work covers a wide range of subjects including climate, geopolitics, wildlife conservation, and boxing. He's widely respected for his long career covering the sport, including writing on legends like Joe Louis. He's authored 3 books. His latest, Arctic Passages, Ice Exploration and the Battle for Power at the Top of the World, explores the Arctic in great detail with deep reporting from what is among the coldest places on the planet. The Arctic's melting ice is directly proportional to the rising global tensions, and Kieran digs deep. Thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you so much for asking me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. A moment ago, you showed me right before we started recording that it's frigid and it's snowing out there. So is Arctic the natural habitat for you that, it was?
It's so funny. It feels that way. And I don't know why. But there's just something that's always kind of attracted me to both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And I'm comfortable in cold weather. I think it's because it's easier to put on layers when you're cold than it is to just, take off. There comes a limit to how many layers you can take off when you're really hot, right?
Yeah.
There's a friend of mine who's a polar explorer makes the distinction. He goes, I don't like being cold. He goes, I like being warm in cold places, which is very different. I think I agree with that philosophy.
Yeah, I guess that's why in Bombay, which is our winters are also hot compared to where you are right now. In winters, we would switch on the fan and then get a blanket on just to feel warm while it is relatively cold.
Right.
Yes. Before we get into the book itself, tell me more about boxing. Where did you get introduced to when did you start covering that? Because you've done a lot there.
Yeah, so this was just a funny little episode that wasn't supposed to keep going. It was in 2003. I was living in a cabin in Alaska, and I'd been writing about the environment and science for a long time. And, I just felt like, maybe you feel this yourself. Sometimes you want to have a slight change to be creatively, to kind of get those juices flowing again. And I'd always been a fan of boxing, and I was always interested in the characters, right? The guy in the corner, the guy who holds the spit bucket, all these kind of people. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to take just a few months just to write something completely different. And I'll go and I'll write a book about, not just about boxing, but about the characters that it attracts. And I went down, I went to Las Vegas, where a lot of boxing takes place still, and spent a lot of time there. Was planning to write a book, couldn't sell the book, and now suddenly needed to make up all the money that I'd lost by doing the research. Ended up writing for ESPN, ended up writing for Reuters, the news agency, ended up being on HBO. And what was supposed to be an 8-month project just to reinvigorate me turned into 20 years of covering boxing.
Amazing. And you very casually slipped in that when I was in a cabin in Alaska, when I lived in a cabin in Alaska, yeah. How was that experience? Can you take us through, to take me through it? Like, what does it mean to live in those conditions?
So I was in Anchorage, which is the big city in Alaska. So it makes it a lot easier. It's not like I was out in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, it was a small cabin. Basically, essentially just one room. It had like this furnace underneath it, and when the furnace came in to fire up, the whole cabin shook. It was just this really flimsy little cabin. It was a shock for anybody who was in there for the first time. And I had a nice wood burning fireplace, and I really liked it. The thing with Alaska, and really the Arctic, more than other cold places, is it's not just the temperature, it's how dark winter gets. And that can be the toughest part of it, because the sun might not rise till about 11, 12 o'clock in winter, and then by about 4, it's going down again. And in the most northern parts of Alaska, it sets in October and rises in February. And that's kind of like the tough routine to deal with. It's like you can deal with the cold, but constant dark is a little difficult, and you find yourself slowing down and your mood maybe isn't quite so great. And then before you know it, everything's melting and it's summer and daylight is 24 hours and you just never want to stop. And so that's the biggest impact on you from living in places like Alaska and otherwise in the Arctic, I think. Yeah.
How do you keep your wits about yourself in places like these?
Some would argue I never did. Yeah, you've got to be fairly disciplined, I think. Some people are affected by it more than others. Some people get these special lamps that the frequency of the light is supposed to replicate sunlight particularly. And so they'll have these lights on their desk. And it is supposed to help with depression and help you feel like you're getting real daylight. A lot of people do things like that. But yeah, I think getting outside is really helpful. I feel for people, like I'm lucky that I always work at home. I feel for people who get up in the morning, go to a windowless office, come back home in the evening, probably never see any daylight for months unless they get out during the day or something. So I think it's a lot of getting out. And yeah, it's a lot of being kind of disciplined with your time and not allowing yourself to fall into the habit of, oh, it's gonna be, it's 4 o'clock, it's dark, I'll go to bed, or, I'll sleep until 11, which is really easy to do if you let it happen.
Right. And how did you manage that in terms of one is the discipline piece? How did you ensure that you had a routine, no matter what your mood was, that you would follow that routine? What was your routine when you were around there, even in the Arctic or in Alaska? How would you go about those 12 week? I mean, how
Well,
many
but
hours
the
would you have
advantage that I had is in being a freelance writer, and I'll never forget this this advice I read in a library book when I decided young that I was interested in being a writer, and it said, I write when I'm inspired, and I make sure that I'm inspired at 9 o'clock every morning. And I always kind of followed that. I understood what that meant was you don't have guaranteed income, so it's up to you to be disciplined and organize your day. Nobody else is going to give you that structure. You have to do it yourself. So I think that helped immensely. And I have one of my favorite memories of living up there is just waking up in the morning and it being very dark, and I would turn on I had a gas stove, and I would turn on the gas stove to boil some water for tea, and just the first light in my cabin would be that the gas flame under the kettle, and then I kind of get going, and then there'd be the whistle of the kettle, and it was really nice and cozy, and then I'd make the fire and just make everything as comfortable as possible, right? And once everything's nice and cozy and comfortable, then you could get going. And it's the same wherever you are in the Arctic. And the main thing, I was actually talking to some people about this recently with the Arctic and your daily schedule. Everything takes a bit longer. Like even if you're just going, say, from one house to like a couple of streets over, you have to put on a bunch of layers. And, so there'll be several different layers, and then you put on the warm coat, and then maybe there's the windproof layer. And then you've got a couple of doors to go out of because Arctic houses always have, like an entryway and then another doorway. So to keep the cold out. And what would be a simple stroll in Mumbai is just like takes a half hour, and you just get used to that. You just adapt for that. Everything's going to take longer. If you're driving, it may be snowy and icy on the road, so you go slowly, which from what I understand is not something that Mumbai drivers do.
Yes.
And everything takes time. And I think once you accept that, you can get into that whole like Arctic rhythm.
And has that Arctic rhythm made you a little more patient as compared to the regular person walking on the street in Vermont or in Mumbai?
That's a really good question. And I think so. I don't know that that's necessarily true, and other people would agree with me, but sometimes I think so. Sometimes I like to think I learn not to sweat the small little details, and sometimes, like everybody else, I get worked up. But I think that's a really good question. I like to think so. I don't know if my partner would agree with me, but I like to think so.
Excellent. That's a good start. And we are very passionate about the subject. You don't write about places without actually visiting them. And these are some of the coldest places on earth. When was the first time do you remember the first moment? This is a cliched question, but it might have a strong memory when you entered the Arctic or when you first saw the glimpse of the place, because you visited the place a few times.
Yes, I actually went to the Antarctic before the Arctic. Initially, the Antarctic is sort of what really, really impressed me. But I gradually grew into the Arctic. And I remember actually that I had my first opportunity to go was actually in 1998. And I was doing some freelance writing. And I was asked if I wanted to go on this icebreaker that was going to have some scientists on it. They were going to do studying of walruses and Arctic birds. And we were also going to visit native Alaska villages, Eskimo villages, and talk to them about changes that they'd seen, over the years as the climate had changed. And I leapt at that opportunity. I didn't have any work lined up. So I remember leaping at that opportunity. And I remember just different scenes from that voyage. I remember us being just in this terrible, terrible fog trying to find this island that had a native village on it, and then the fog suddenly disappearing, and us seeing this tiny little native village at the bottom of this mountain in the middle of Arctic waters, thinking, how do people live here? I remember seeing my first polar bear on that trip, and then many, many other polar bears. Our ship at one point got hit by a very large, very heavy piece of ice that was caught in a current. And it was so large and so heavy that it pulled our ship off anchor for a while, and our captain had to figure out a way to get us out. So I remember all these wonderful just images of it being such a different and exciting place. And how it differed from the Antarctic is that here was this wonderful, remote, cold place, but it had people. And I was fascinated by that. I went to the post office in this small little village, and it had a sign telling you to be careful when you open the door and look out for polar bears. And I'm like, what an amazing way to live. And I was so fascinated by that immediately prompted me to move to that cabin in Alaska. Like about 6 months later, I moved. I thought, this is fascinating. There's lots to write about. I love this environment. And I just upped and I moved. The kind of thing you do when you're younger that as you get older, you don't necessarily do. But yeah, that's what prompted me, that one trip. And then since then, as you said, I've made a number of trips up there, yes.
What did your parents say? What were their reaction when you told them, this is what I'm going to be doing? I'm going to be somewhere in Alaska for a while. Where? In a cabin. How am I going to live? I'll figure it out.
Dad loved it. Dad was in the Royal Navy. And I think a lot of my interest in the world came from sitting on his knee when I was very, very young and looking at the photographs he took of his travels. And so I loved the idea of being places, traveling, seeing different parts of the world. And he liked it, me doing this, because the Arctic and Antarctic, they were just two parts of the world that he had never been to. And so he liked the fact that I went on ships. They were different types of ships. They were icebreakers, but they were still like had a little bit of a bonding sense with him of being on ships. And he thought it was pretty cool. He liked the adventure. He wasn't sure if I'd manage, but once I, settled in and all of that, he loved it. I think he enjoyed living vicariously through my little updates of life in the frozen north.
And does it help that I'm imagining that somebody who worked in the Navy would have discipline by default, and would he have passed some of it to you? Or
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so, very much, and very much a sense of being serious about, you have play and you have work, and being very serious about no matter what your project is, even if it's a project for yourself or a project around the house or something that you're doing, you do it properly, you research it, you do it, you check it again. I definitely picked that up from Dad. Yes, no question at all.
And do these little things help when you live in conditions like the Arctic, where, let's say, if you're washing a vessel, or wanting to make sure you keep things in the right place, something that parents teach their kids all the time, that everything must have its place and everything should be in its place, for instance. Now, does that go a long way to take away all the tension that, okay, at least my basics are in place, now let me get to work?
Huge. Great question, and huge. Yes. Once you have those, and obviously you're very rarely, if I'm up in the Arctic, I'm very rarely alone. So generally working with a group of people, and that makes it all the more important, doesn't it? To do things like, just like you said, everything has it. Don't leave things out. Don't leave it to somebody else to put things away, or, all these kind of things. It's a communal space. Everybody works together. Everybody helps each other. So yes, I think that all helps immensely. And it's a great observation that, you get those basics, those fundamental basics of how to, and when I first started going to Alaska and the Arctic, I felt awful because I didn't know what to do, right? Just the basic things. Like, if you're going to go for a drive your car, you might have to spend a bit of time scraping ice off the windshield. And I sat in the car like with a friend who only had one ice scraper, and I'm just sitting there thinking, should I be helping? How does this work? And then after a while, you just fall into a rhythm of, oh, okay, I've got a scraper here. I'll help. I'll do this. Or you know what I mean? It just takes a little while to understand what you should be doing to help yourself and help others, if that makes sense.
And I can't imagine the struggles now that you're saying this is a struggle into 26 for somebody visiting that place. You, in your book, have also written about the explorers of the past, and in quite detail. And some of that is quite fascinating, in that you don't have technology beyond rudimentary equipment. You may not have the funding to go with. Why would anybody give you the money to just go out to check if there is something that exists in your mind? Is it really there for better prospects? Can you give a couple of examples of what your ancestors, or rather your kind back in the day, had to face
Oh my
to explore
goodness.
things?
The number of times that I think this now, being out in the cold and putting on my Gore-Tex clothing and my layers and all these clothes that have taken decades of research to get exactly right, so they're super warm and they allow you to breathe at the same time. And you think to these guys who started trying to explore the Arctic in like the 15th centuries and beyond, for them, survival gear was, if they were lucky, they had an extra sweater or something, and they had no idea what they were heading into. They must have been absolutely terrified. And the idea being that, there was this like notion of somewhere up in the Arctic, what was motivating European explorers was there was a passageway, they thought, to make it for Europeans to make it over to India and China and to be able to trade in spices and silks. And they were convinced there was a direct line through the Arctic. And that's what they were constantly looking for. And to expect a short ocean voyage, and at the end of it, you're in India or China, and to in fact be confronted with the Arctic, what one explorer wrote called white bears of monstrous bigness, severe cold, huge amounts of ice that they would never have imagined before. It must have been absolutely terrifying. And yes, quite frequently, these ships would get caught in the ice, sometimes for many years. One ship called the Victory in the 1830s, captained by a guy called John Ross, was planning to try to find a way through what we now call the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic, hoping that they would maybe just have to spend one winter in the Arctic, and they prepared for that. They ended up having to spend 4 winters in the Arctic, for which they had not prepared. They had no radio communication, obviously. They had no way of communicating with the outside world at all. The outside world had no idea if they were alive. They had no idea if they were going to live. They had to learn how to hunt seals and walrus and other kind of life and figure out what worked and what didn't. They didn't know about scurvy, so they didn't have, fresh fruit and things like that. And obviously you run out of it in the Arctic anyway. The immense struggles, and they're all on this tiny ship, by our standards, a tiny ship. How these people did that is remarkable. And the number of times where, I think, wow, the bravery, I don't know whether it was bravery or just blissful ignorance or both, but yes, it's kind of astonishing. They sometimes made life harder for themselves by refusing to listen to the advice of the indigenous inhabitants who they encountered, because they felt, we're white Europeans, we know. I mean, who are these people? What do they know? The most successful Arctic explorers, like Roald Amundsen, for example, who is the first person to the South Pole and the first person through the Northwest Passage, he was a Norwegian. There was a Scottish man called John Rae. They tried to live like the Inuit. They figured out how they dressed, how they moved, how they lived, the pace of life. They tried to learn from them. And those were the guys who tended to be the most successful by far.
And your book, you talked about people living in places like these, which surprised you or fascinated you when you went there for the first time. I mean, there are small villages there, say. Can you explain a bit for somebody who has no connection to the Arctic, and I may never visit there, how is it like for locals in an area like that? And how is their disposition, their mood? What do they do every day, and how do they get by?
The thing that most surprised me quite often was their disposition tended to be wonderful. They tended to be some of the happiest people I'd ever seen. And they were just very, very friendly. But for me, it just felt, like you said, what do you do? And I think, so to give you a sense, there would be quite often, particularly around the coast of Alaska, the northern and northwest coast of Alaska, a number of isolated small villages that tend to be on the coast. And there may be a couple of hundred people, if that. There generally tend to be no roads in and out. If you're going to travel from one place to the other, it's either by boat or you'll go across the sea ice when it gets very cold in the winter. They tend to, nowadays, they have a bit of a combination. They have a reason why they live where they live is because they traditionally hunt whales and seals. And so they wait for the ice to freeze and then they can go further out onto the ice. They drag their boats out onto the ice, put them a little bit offshore, and then they'll go into the water and they'll try to hunt whales. Incredibly dangerous. Small boats, often with handheld harpoons, very big whales, tremendously, tremendously dangerous. If they kill a whale, they'll drag it onto the ice. The village will come out, and the whole village will chop up the whale. They'll eat large parts of the whale. The oil in the whale they'll use for lighting or heating and things like that, and that becomes a very important part of their social structure, is hunting the whale and celebrating that. Nowadays, also, they'll often have flights in with some kind of supplies. So it can be a bit odd now. You'll go to some villages, and there'll be people who still use dogs to travel over ice and who go out and hunt whales. There are other people who like watching the WWE and eating macaroni and cheese that's been brought in by supply flights. So now it's kind of like an interesting clash as increasingly younger generations think, wow, what is there to do here? And they can see TV now and they're like, wow, just going to Anchorage is a lot more interesting, it seems to me. And so it's a bit of a struggle sometimes for some of these places to continue to survive.
Because you talked about TV, we live in an age of distractions, and at a place like that, time will slow, and you have to get used to the boredom around you, is what I would imagine.
Yeah. And I think they just also think, to get back to that earlier comment about how everything just takes longer. So your day gets filled up, right? And so, a lot of times if they might use, say, caribou skin or they like to help make clothing or things like that. So some people might be just stitching things together, or other people, might be getting together and making communal food. Or other people are out gathering plants, things like that. I think there's always a sense of something to do, and you just sort of also fall in more to that rhythm of being dictated by the daylight and the evening time, and I think you a bit more adjust to those natural rhythms. But yeah, I think it's just more, life is slower, life is quieter, life is busier with the little things, I think. And I also wonder if that's part of the reason why they were so kind and friendly, is because I think in that situation you end up putting a lot of your energies into like your social interaction. You're really relying on the people around you to survive. And I think that's very, very important. And I think that helps make you much more conducive perhaps to being friendly with people, because it's in your interest to be friendly with people, apart from the fact that these are the only 200 people in the world around here. So we do need to get on.
Did you ever regale them with stories from your part of the world when you say, hey, we've got this and that, and do they get surprised that, ooh, this is like magic, maybe?
It was less of that, and sometimes because we came up and we wanted to talk to them about how the climate had changed, and it was more that they thought we were going to give them a hard time because, oh yeah, we know we have two-stroke engines in our little snowmobiles, and they probably put out a lot of pollution, and we're like, no, we're causing it. It's our world is doing that. Our world is doing all of this to you. And sometimes that would be a bit of a surprise that they didn't realize that. And it was a bit hard to wrap their heads around a little bit sometimes. But also, obviously in the larger native villages, people are well connected. Nothing's a mystery to them really any more than, probably they're far more familiar with what we get up to than we are still with them,
Right. And to your point of how they innocently thought they were the guilty party,
Yeah.
the facts are harrowing. I read that the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the world at large, which is a pretty big deal. Can you give a couple of instances where you actually saw things changing in the Arctic, and what is the kind of scale that you as a journalist, as a resident there, has seen and that the world should pay attention to?
Well, in the, whatever it is, 25 or so years that I've been going to the Arctic, even in that period of time, I've seen a lot of difference. And the biggest difference is in the length of seasons. Winter starts a lot later, it ends earlier, summer lasts longer. The patterns are less predictable. Snowfall might come when it always used to, it might not. It might be more, it might be less. They might go long periods without it. As the temperatures change, the cycles of other things change. Plants change, insects change in response to that. Like the whole cycle of everything, which is obviously far more challenging for these people who are living up there, who are living off of the land and off of the ocean, and for whom being able to predict these cycles and work with these cycles is so important. And they need to be able to know that, oh yes, and by June it'll be this warm and we can go out and collect these berries and so on and so forth. Well, if the berries have already bloomed in or come out in May, then everything's messed up, and now the insects that pollinate those flowers and those plants up in the Arctic, they've come and gone earlier. That's the big difference. It's the change in timing. That's the most noticeable thing, and the less predictability. And that change in timing for Arctic peoples and Arctic wildlife means so much, because you're always living on the edge if you're living in the Arctic, even if you're a polar bear, where you're supremely well adapted to the Arctic. You need to be able to get all the food you can while you can. So if you're a polar bear that lives on the sea ice, which is what polar bears do. They wait for the sea to freeze and they wander out on the ice in search of seals. If you're constantly getting, say summer ends 2 weeks later and begins 2 weeks earlier, that's a whole month less of sea ice that you have to hunt, to be out and hunting. And when you're always just on the edge, that's a huge difference. And that's why we're seeing things like, we're not just seeing declining numbers of polar bears, we're seeing a lot more thin polar bears, or thinner than we're used to seeing, because now those opportunities to eat are becoming diminished. We're seeing fewer polar bears being born, because if a polar bear mom doesn't have the strength, she's just, not going to get pregnant, or not going to last to full term. And so you're just starting to see these little changes. In the one place where I go regularly, a place called Churchill in Canada, where there are a lot of polar bears, we've been noticing foxes have become more common. Arctic foxes, which are small and white and very common in the Arctic, they're being displaced now by red foxes and gray foxes from further south that are much larger, and now they're preying on the Arctic foxes. And now we're seeing a lot of foxes that we didn't see before up there. Brown bears are moving up into the Arctic more than they were before. There's just all these, you'll hear a lot from people who have lived there for generations saying, oh yeah, it always used to be that we would be able to go out on the boats in, June and start to do this, but now we can't, now it's May or now it's April, and now it's more dangerous because the ice is thin. Those people who I talked about who go out on the ice to hunt bowhead whales, already dangerous, now even more dangerous because they don't know if the ice is going to be stable underneath them, because ice is becoming a lot thinner. It also, sorry, this is a long answer, but it also, one reason why we should be concerned is, as the Arctic sea ice disappears, one of the things that Arctic sea ice does is it reflects sunlight back, so it helps keep the Arctic cool. And one of the reasons why the Arctic is heating so much is that there's a feedback effect. Ice is melting, and so instead we're seeing like open ocean water that absorbs sunlight, that makes it warmer, that makes more ice melt. And then after a while, that starts to affect the weather elsewhere. It starts to affect ocean currents. It starts to affect air currents. Where I live in Vermont in the northern United States, we're getting colder periods of winter because the air currents that go around the Arctic are being disrupted, and we're getting Arctic cold weather is coming down here. So all these changes are happening, and you think, oh, it's the Arctic, it doesn't matter, and maybe they'll be happy to be warm. No, it's changing this entire region bit by bit by bit. Not so much that you'd see from year to year, but from decade to decade, you can absolutely notice the difference, and it's real and it's happening.
And there are people like you who've documented this, who've lived through it. And why do you think there is a debate about whether climate change is real or not? If you have so much evidence, you still have presidents of countries say it's a hoax perpetrated by the scientists. These are the experts talking. There's enough data to back it up. Why do you think that is? And it's coming from educated folk, not that it's from people who, or is it the equivalent to this would be people not believing that Earth is round, or if man really did land on the moon?
Exactly. Unfortunately, some people don't believe Earth is round or man landed on the moon. And they tend to be the same people who don't believe in climate change. A lot of times we have found that these folks actually know very well that climate change is happening. It's just that it's in their financial interest to pretend that it isn't. It's not an accident that it's countries that rely a lot on sales of oil or coal that really don't want to have to take what they think are going to be economy disrupting steps to address climate change. And so the best way to deal with that is to try to pretend that climate change isn't happening. And so that's what's happening. That's why and then you have some countries where the politics is a little broken, like here in the United States. And it just, the powerful lobbyists are able to say, oh, no, there's no climate change. It's all a leftist plot, nothing to worry about. And nothing gets done, or very little gets done. And it's a shame because there are basically a few countries and people in a few countries who are dragging everyone else back in terms of taking action. And they're the countries that most need to take action. The most complex and interesting example is China, which has become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but also is by a mile the world leader now in solar panels, wind power, electric vehicles. It's lapping the world with its quality of electric vehicles. So China's an interesting case. India's interesting too, because it's still such a reliance on coal, of course, and you're still building more coal, but there is also an interest in alternative energy methods. Russia's another obstacle because they want to continue to earn money from oil. So mostly it is just a vested interest. People don't want to acknowledge that climate change is happening because it will cost them financially. There's also, in this particular country, the United States, a religious element in that more fundamentalist Christians refuse to believe that we mere humans can be altering the climate. Well, you have people like, I know somebody who's a very good climate scientist, but is also a Christian, and she points out parts of, Christian texts that show it's our responsibility to look after, the world and so forth. But one of the things that we have found is that outside those folks who refuse to accept climate change for financial reasons, there are also people like that, like those fundamentalist Christians who refuse to accept it for emotional reasons, and they won't respond to factual arguments. You have to find a way to appeal to their emotions to get them on board. It's more of an effort than it should be, given how tremendously clear the science is.
Does that frustrate you as somebody who knows the subject so well?
So much. And especially, I have to say, the last 10 years have been difficult. I really thought we were making real progress, and then the whole politics in this country has changed. And I've been surprised at what a struggle it's been. I thought it would continue to get easier, and it isn't. And that's shocking to me. I think ultimately the thing that will finally drive people to do what needs to be done is one of the things we're noticing here. I don't know if you guys have been noticing it, but certainly here in North America, there have been a lot more extreme weather events, a lot more wildfires, things like that, severe hurricanes. And I think that's going to be what ultimately gets people's attention.
Well, here it's the heat waves and occasional cyclones, which we didn't know. So we don't have these landfalls, is that what they call? And then cyclones or tornadoes. We don't have any of those, but we do have unseasonal rainfall, among other things. Yeah.
Right.
And another thing, you talked about China and you talked about vested interests. Now, one of the unintended consequences of global warming or climate change is that while the Arctic melts, that would end up creating potentially a trade route for countries, you write, to be happy about. Suddenly a route that would take, and you'll have to help me out here, what would be a long route to connect two countries when they are shipping millions of dollars worth of containers. Now you could have a shortcut, lesser fuel, faster shipping, people make profits. So I would imagine some part of the world is praying for more of this.
Absolutely, 100%. And one of the things that I do find dispiriting is I think the enthusiasm or the readiness of many countries to prepare for a world without Arctic ice than to actually try to stop us getting to a world without Arctic ice. And you're exactly right. And it ties back into that question you were asking about earlier, explorers, in that these explorers, thought that there was going to be this passage or passages through the Arctic, and there wasn't because there was so much ice.
Hmm.
In a strange sense, it's like what's happening is what people couldn't do in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s. They're now like, oh, great, now we finally get an opportunity to do it. And yeah, that's very much what a lot of countries are looking at. And to make it worse, they've gone beyond the, oh gosh, we could have these passages in the ice and that would be great for trade, to we have to fight other countries over the right to this. And so then you have the United States military saying, oh, China and Russia are in the Arctic. Of course, Russia's in the Arctic. It's the largest Arctic nation. We have to do more. And then you have Donald Trump saying, we have to have Greenland. We're going to invade Greenland and take Greenland to keep China and Russia away. All these nonsensical arguments that it's very Cold War-like. And you remember back in the days in the Cold War where the Soviet Union and the US would be finding any excuse to try to increase their military or see a threat somewhere. It's getting to that now. And I recently wrote an article that said, it's conflict in the Arctic, despite what increasingly people, certainly in the United States, say, is not inevitable. The biggest threat to security in Arctic is assuming that conflict is inevitable when it absolutely isn't. And the other point that I like to make to folks who say, oh, well, this would be great. There'll be these trade routes in the Arctic. It'll be fantastic. Is by the time all the ice has disappeared from the Arctic as a result of climate change, the impacts of climate change elsewhere are also going to be immense and greater. It's not just going to stop everywhere else while it warms in the Arctic. So, if it's 45 degrees every day in winter in Mumbai, you're probably not going to be that excited about the fact that a melting Arctic means you can get your packages from somewhere a day earlier. And that's what people seem to be missing here in this rush to try to exploit a melting Arctic and create these trade routes and have this competition with each other. The Arctic isn't the only place that's warming and then nowhere else is. If we just let the Arctic melt, we're doing horrible things to the rest of the planet as well. So by the time we have Arctic trade routes, I don't think people are going to care about Arctic trade routes.
That's interesting. And the context of this all, could it also be if somebody were to play a devil's advocate and say, look, for the globalization or for trade, something of this sort is necessary because shipping lanes are under tremendous pressure. I think not too long ago, 7 out of the world's 10 biggest shipping companies, they said, we will not go through the Red Sea, where, you had Houthis, which is that Yemeni rebel group. They were brazenly attacking these commercial vessels. And fewer ships were using the Suez Canal, which is a shortcut, I think, from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Even the Panama Canal, the volume of trade that passed through it, it connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Now, that had declined significantly. So now, with so much pressure, it's good that the Arctic is melting so that at least we can compensate for it. How would you respond to such folks?
Well, I mean, it's an argument that is raised, and it's an interesting thing, and it's one of the aspects that has sort of motivated a lot of those folks who argue for Arctic trade routes. So I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, a ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, and nothing could get through. And Vladimir Putin was very much saying, well, you should come through the Arctic. Come through our passageway. It's fantastic. We don't have anything like that. We don't have any rebels. You're not going to get your ship, it's not going to be taken by pirates or anything like that. And yeah, there was huge decline in Suez trade last year. Interestingly, one of the reasons why trade has been declining in the Panama Canal is because of climate change, in that there's actually changes in rainfall that is affecting the water supply into the canal. The canal is shrinking. The levels are actually getting a little bit lower, and it's becoming harder to navigate. So yeah, that same allowing climate change to happen might open up one trade route, but it closes another. But the other argument that I would put to that is that people are still, even as ice is melting in the Arctic, there's a lot of difference between ice being melting enough to change the environment or to create a lot more open water and ice melting enough to be able to regularly put ships through. There's still a lot of ice. And in fact, one of the things that is happening is that in some cases, as some ice melts, it had previously been holding back ice from further north, and now that ice from further north is coming through, and so some of these sea lanes are actually temporarily becoming more clogged with ice, because it's just how these things develop. They don't happen in a straight line. So my argument would be, sure, that would be fine, but you're still going to have to wait 20 years or so before all of these shipping lanes are clear enough that you can really start using them. Plus, there's very little, except in the Russian Arctic, there's no infrastructure anyway. So you'd have to build that infrastructure. So it's probably a lot easier to just try to deal with the issues around the Horn of Africa, part of which are also caused by climate change, or the Panama Canal, and deal with the existing infrastructure and existing trade routes, rather than just wait for one part of the world to completely change and then use it.
And while all of this is happening, also write about the is it the confusion or what? You might help me understand here. Is America says that Arctic, though that area is international and can be claimed
Right.
by anyone. Then you have China and Russia. They say, look, it's under our control. China recently said that it's an Arctic nation or some such. I forget. They suddenly said they staked claim, and they've got these icebreakers that the ships that they suddenly started manufacturing. Now, what is that all about? Of course, there is geopolitics, but why is there no clarity about the legal status of who owns what?
That's a really good question, and it's really integral. So if you look at a map and say a really good way to sort of explain and understand the issues here is that you look at a map of Canada and you look at a map of Arctic Canada, and what maybe folks might not appreciate is the northern part of Canada is a whole bunch of islands, lots and lots and lots of islands, with these passageways going through. So Canada says, therefore, that if the ice melts between these islands and that creates a passage from Atlantic to Pacific, it's going through all our islands. It's clearly our territory. And we have the right to sort of manage who goes in and out of our territory. Russia agrees with that because Russia's in a similar situation. It wants to manage trade and benefit from trade that goes through its Arctic waters. So Russia and Canada both say, they're in national. Then the United States and China both say, no, we want to use it too. We want to be able to come because it's a passageway from Pacific to Atlantic. It counts as an international passageway. So if we're just going through it under international law, we're allowed to just go through. And so this is more of a debate about existing international maritime law and the status of these different seaways. And there are lawyers, international lawyers, who could give you arguments on both sides. And generally, Canada and the United States, up to this point, have agreed to disagree. And the United States says it won't recognize Canadian territory, but it will notify Canada if its ships are going through the Northwest Passage, that kind of thing. So at the moment, it's still a hypothetical dispute, but that's definitely part of what's going on there. And yes, as you said, China now actually has more icebreakers than the United States, which is incredible because, they're the world's second largest shipping nation, commercial shipping nation. And, partly I think China, a little like India, is also, as it grows and becomes stronger and richer, is looking to position itself as a power befitting its size, and it looks at where the West is operating. It's like, well, we should be doing that too. So I think there's certainly an element of that. There's an element of, as a commercial shipping nation, it's in its interests to long-term interests, and China, as we know, plans very, very long-term to start planning its shipping industry in that kind of way. And then there also is, that's just old-fashioned superpower dynamic with we want it, and if we want it, you can't have it kind of a thing. That's just so childish, and I thought we'd grown out of during the Cold War, but apparently we haven't.
No, I think it's just the next generation of leaders come in and they'd like to try that again. Maybe this time the result might be different.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you're right that there is some oil to be had as well, some 90 billion barrels of oil somewhere below the ice. Of course, I would imagine it will take a lot of effort and money to dig that up. How important is that? Because now you have shale, am I getting it right? Is that shale oil or what is it? Fracking, through fracking?
Yeah, from shale. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right. And you've got enough oil today than you thought you would a few years ago. But then
Yeah.
you also have minerals, is what I read somewhere, that, and you cover a bit of it, where what you need for these electric car batteries, zinc that is used in solar panels and wind turbines, you've got copper, which is used in all things electric. All of this is there in
Yeah.
Arctic's green minerals. So there is a lot to be had beyond just a shipping lane.
That's absolutely right. And that's part of the interest in Greenland, because Greenland in particular
Hmm.
appears to have quite a lot of some of these, rare earth minerals, things that we need, as you said, for things like cell phone batteries, car batteries, all that kind of, especially EV batteries, all that kind of stuff. So yes,
Hmm.
that is definitely a factor. And one of the things that I have learned when it comes to things like fossil fuel companies is that there's never enough, right? There's
Hmm.
just,
Hmm.
and and I admit maybe I'm being a bit idealistic here, but for me, the notion that the lesson that you should take away from the Arctic melting as a result of burning too much fossil fuels is, oh, this is great. Now we'll have access to more fossil fuels, is so obviously the wrong way to look at things. But there you go. That is definitely part of the interest, is
Hmm.
in the idea of what kind of mineral and oil resources could be down there. But I also think, again, there's just not enough taking seriously how difficult it is to operate in the Arctic. Even now, even though the ice is melting, there's still lots of ice. It's still
Hmm.
cold. Conditions are
Yeah.
still rough. It's going to take so much money and time and effort and infrastructure that there are just so many simpler options. But I think also, and I write about this in the book, that there's an element of, well, this is the way we've always done it. Let's just keep doing that. Addressing a world that is getting warmer, where extreme weather impacts are becoming greater, that's hard. But if
Hmm.
we kind of just ignore that or try to buy our way out of it and then dig some more and exploit some more, well, we're used to that. We're set up to do that. And then if countries come into conflict, well, that's great. We've got militaries. That's great. That's fantastic. Let's just keep doing what we've always done. And I think that's a huge element in how the world is approaching all of this. Like this, and specifically really the Western world. I don't mean to tar everyone with the same brush, but largely the Western world is, well, this is how we've always done it. We've explored, we've exploited, we've moved on. Let's keep doing that. And the same old things, the stuff that's been going on for the last decades and centuries, isn't going to work anymore.
Is there anything that you think countries can do while they step on the gas, because they will not step off it given the geopolitical influence, meaning you want to blunt each other's influence, so you just keep doing more of it at the cost of the ecology, for instance. So, what is reasonable, in your opinion, that would help take care of the interests of some of the countries without harming the environment beyond what is necessary? Unfortunately, we are at a place where it's not good. I mean, countries are not scaling back their ambitions; they are only increasing that. So, what is the best case scenario here?
It's difficult. And I have
That
a,
that
I guess, a
answer,
different.
that answer did deserve a sigh, because it's a tough one to answer.
And yeah, I think the enthusiasm or my approach to that answer is different again than it would have been 10 years ago.
Hmm.
And I'm struggling to find answers these days. I wasn't expecting the world to take this kind of,
Hmm.
or specifically, obviously I'm affected by things are very different here in the United States. I wasn't expecting the US to take such an anti-science turn and the way that it has done. For example, Russia is at times becoming very difficult to predict. In an ideal world, what is the best thing that people can do? Recognize, and a country specifically, actually look at some of the good things that China is doing. Look at how investing in a green economy is benefiting China immensely. It's reducing pollution. They are now the world leaders in EV batteries, solar
Hmm.
panels, electric vehicles, wind power. It is greatly improving their society already, even as they continue to burn an awful lot of coal. I don't want to, deny that. Also, don't want to deny that they have their own expansionist kind of ideas. But if you look at, instead of saying, oh my goodness, if we have to get off oil and gas, if we have to stop burning fossil fuels, we'll all end up in the Stone Age. Not at all. It's very easy to make a transition to a more, well, at least much easier for rich Western nations to make it a fairly seamless transition to a non-fossil fuel economy. Some Scandinavian nations have done it. In Norway, I think they don't sell any internal combustion engine vehicles at all anymore, for example. And obviously, it's going to be easier for some countries than others. They have better resources than others. But stop looking at a transition to a clean economy, one that burns fewer fossil fuels, that doesn't affect the environment. Stop looking at it as a threat and look at it as an opportunity, because it really is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for new technologies. It's an opportunity to have cleaner growth. It's an opportunity to improve air pollution, which is so important for so many places. So look at it as an opportunity to be seized and taken advantage of, not as something to run away from.
Excellent. And if there is one thing that you would like readers to never miss in the book, or one thing that you think we haven't talked about, but which is close to your heart that you've covered in the book, what might that be?
I think it's that the tendency for a lot of us who don't live in the Arctic is to just focus on, understandably, how brutal it is, how cold, how inhospitable. But we must always remember that there are millions of people, not many millions, but there are a few million people who live in the Arctic and for whom it is home and for whom it is integral to their very nature, their very culture. There are people who generation upon generation upon generation upon generation have grown up in the Arctic. Their way of life is being threatened. We are collectively committing a very slowly unfolding cultural genocide on people in the Arctic. Let's remember there are people there. There are cultures. There's history. I love polar bears, but it's not just polar bears. It's not just ice. It's people as well. And we are very quietly, slowly wiping them out. And like people anywhere, they deserve respect and the opportunity to live their own lives as they wish to live them.
Thank you, Kieran. That's beautifully put. I think we don't put, until we have a human element to the whole thing, we don't seem to, as human beings, we may not even empathize. Okay, it's just a non-living thing melting somewhere.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you look at the language that we use to describe the Arctic, where we talk about the Northwest Passage or the Northeast Passage, it means we just see the Arctic as a place to be gone through, passed through, that's in the way. Whereas for all these people, it's everything. It's their world. It's their life.
Yeah. When you write a book of this kind, how difficult is the research part, and how do you end up writing about it? You can't Google these things up. You are actually there in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, or in a cabin in Alaska. Now, when do you take notes? Do you do them as you go along? Things get slow there. What are some of the challenges of covering or reporting from places like these?
Yeah, I think it's fairly this was a really tricky book, actually, specifically to deal with this book for a couple of reasons. That I wanted it to be based around 3 separate travelogues in the Arctic, and I wanted one to be the North Pole, and I was able to get to the North Pole. I hitched a ride on a cruise ship to the North Pole. I was able to hitch a ride on a ship that went through the Canadian Arctic. Then COVID hit, and there was clearly obviously no ships were going to allow strangers on. The last thing you want is COVID on a ship. And there was a huge decline in ship traffic anyway. And we desperately needed to stay away from Arctic communities, because if COVID had hit Arctic communities, oh my goodness. So I'm like, okay, well, that's going to be problematic. So then I kind of switched a bit more to paying attention to talking to folks about the geopolitical aspects of it. And I thought, well, when COVID finishes, then I can go to the Russian Arctic and I can finish my travel research. And then COVID started to pass, and then Russia invaded Ukraine, and now nobody's traveling to Russia basically. And so this required an awful lot of on-the-fly changes to how I went about things, and I leaned a bit more on previous voyages and stuff like that. But yeah, when I'm on a voyage, I journal a lot, and I find that a really effective way because there can be so many different new stimuli or things you encounter, and it's just like, oh, I don't want to forget that I saw that polar bear, or what a great conversation that I had with so and so about life in the Arctic, and so yeah, when I'm actually up there, I do journal a lot, and I make notes very, very extensively.
And do you write the first draft very quickly, or do you agonize on every one paragraph over the next one? Over the years, has it changed because you've been in this business or in this trade or craft for a while now?
That's a great question. I try to do a very quick, rough first draft and not get bogged down. Doesn't always work that way. I find when I'm getting bogged down, I tend to find maybe that's I ask myself why I'm getting bogged down, and I think, well, maybe I'm trying to do it in the wrong way, and maybe if I push through in this way, it's not actually interesting. Maybe the reason I'm getting bogged down is that I'm not finding it interesting, and so if I'm not finding it interesting, a reader won't find it interesting. So I always find personally the hardest thing to learn as a writer is what not to write or what to leave out. And once you get used to you know what, I know I just spent a week on this section, but it doesn't work, and I'll just take it out and I'll put it aside, and maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. That's rough, right? Letting bits go that you spent ages on. That's what I find the toughest. But I try to do a fairly rough first draft. I used to sometimes do a longhand first draft,
Ooh.
which I don't do now. And then maybe I'll print something up and do like scribbles on it and so forth. But I think my writing process is different now than it was in the early days when I only had a typewriter and every draft was kind of a bit more important. I think there's probably a lot more ongoing editing nowadays than there used to be.
That is very interesting. You've lived in an era where you've typed things
Yeah.
out on a typewriter, and I think there is one
Yeah.
theory where technology can also change the way we think. You've written on a piece of paper, you then typed on
Yep.
the way we write, think,
Yep.
because I think it was Nietzsche, the philosopher, when he switched from writing to typing, his prose suddenly started becoming shorter. So did you see that
Fascinating.
happening with your writing as well as technology changed?
I think it's benefited my writing. I think
Yeah.
because it's enabled me. I think it has very much changed it because I will read and reread and reread sometimes, right? And I'll look and
Yeah.
I'll be like, And obviously you don't want to get into a place where you're overdoing that. But yeah, I think it has, because I do remember like that process with typewriters. And that's when I would sometimes do a first draft longhand. And then I type it up very roughly, not worrying about doing it properly, and maybe just single spaced at that point. And then I'd be like, okay, now I'm getting ready to do the double spaced draft. And you got to type carefully and not make mistakes, or, or go back up and use the liquid paper if you made a mistake and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it has made a difference. I think for me, it's benefited the way I write.
Great. And last question, Kieran,
Yeah.
is there any, and you talked a little bit about your dad at the beginning, any parental advice that you got while you were growing up that you hold dear to yourself even today, that you said, that's one thing that I'll always do?
Yeah, my dad was responsible for a lot of this. One of the things he was responsible for was apparently when I was very young. I love to sleep now, but apparently when I was very young, I wasn't into it, and I would start coming downstairs just as Dad was coming upstairs and saying, "I've had enough sleep now," and instead of reading to me, he would have me read to him, and so I learned to read super early, and then he would help me out, and then. And so, yeah, very early on, I learned to read pretty well. And
what age? How old were
well,
you?
so
Remember that?
I want to say I was reading pretty well by 4 or 5. Like I was just reading some old report cards because I had this memory of this happening, and I found some old report cards in my parents' old house that they would even have me go up a class to read to the class older than me when I was about 4, let's say 5, which is kind of amazing, really.
Yeah.
And the other thing he would do is when I wanted to know what a word was, instead of just telling me, he'd ask me to try and figure it out. He goes, well, what's the context? What do you think it says? And then he goes, well, why don't you look it up? And so it's very specific advice for raising a writer, but I like the way that he he was always there, to help, but he kind of put some onus on me to do my own initiative. I think that's helped me. I think that's helped, go back to the beginning of our conversation about being organized and about being disciplined and all of that. I think that plays into all of that, actually. And I think that's tremendously beneficial. And I was always very impressed with the job that my parents did with me, with myself and my brothers, really. That, I always knew they were there and they were very loving, but they sort of expected me to look after myself a little bit as much as possible, if you know what I mean. And
Indeed.
I think that has stood me in good stead through the years.
That's great to know. My report card was a little different, Kieran, because we had these unit tests, meaning after 3 months we had to go through these exams. And then I stumbled into my sixth grade report card where the teacher in very good handwriting has written what I lacked. And he said, can do better. That was the last line. The next semester, again, a couple of complaints and can do better. In the last one I read recently, it just said, can do better. Because
no, the rest. Oh well.
she lost hope. Anyway, Kieran, congratulations on all the accolades that you've received on this
Thank
book,
you.
including having been named as among the best books of the year by The Economist, which is pretty cool.
Amazing honor.
Congratulations.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
indeed. And thank you so much for sparing more than what we had bargained for. The time that you spend on this podcast is really, really very pleasurable. And all the best with your next trip to the Atlantic and the Arctic, whenever it is.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. I've really enjoyed the interview. It's been great. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Kieran.